Thank you everyone for joining us for the Pardot Developer Experience, expanding your marketing capabilities. My name is Christopher Cornett. I'm a product manager at Salesforce Pardot and responsible for our developer experience and API. Dwayne?
Dwayne Watts. I'm also a product manager at Salesforce and responsible for our sandboxes that you'll hear a little bit about.
Hey, I'm Mike Fazio, VP of Operations at Sercante and general API lover and sometime nerd.
Mike Cruiser, also with Sercante. I use the Pardot API to bend Pardot to my well, and I also help build integrations into Pardot.
So before we get started, some of you have probably seen this maybe a few times over the course of the couple days so far. We're going to be talking about some things that we are either working on or will be working on. So be sure to make any of your purchasing decisions based off of what is currently in the product today, and not necessarily what is coming. So with that, let's run through a few things that we're going to get into. We're going to first talk about why we've got this Pardot Developer Experience, why it's something that we're working on right now. Then we're going to get into some of the common use cases, what the tools are to address some of these use cases, and then where we're going to be taking these tools going forward. And then we've got our good friends up here from Sercante to talk about some real-world applications that have been done thus far using these tools today. So with that, we're going to talk about, again, how and why we are trying to introduce this Pardot Developer Experience. So about that, what are we talking about when it comes to the Pardot Developer Experience? So we're looking at 4 core pillars that we consider as part of this experience, and all built on that foundation of trust that you've known to come and appreciate from a Salesforce perspective. So first, we've got our enablement resources, so things that you're used to, like guides and how-tos, for using the API, and pretty soon looking at some sandboxes and things of that nature. You've got the partner community, so a lot of you all are members of that community where you can get some additional help, and then coming into the future, looking at doing some resources from a trailhead perspective as it relates to development on Pardot. We've got the environments that you're looking at, so we've got a Pardot Developer Edition that we'll discuss in a bit, along with the introduction of sandboxes and what that roadmap looks like. And then last, and certainly not least, the APIs. So we're looking at one-to-one API, bulk API, async API, and how you can use that to, again, augment what you're doing today. And all of that wrapped up into a unified platform feel. So getting that same look and feel that you've experienced with Salesforce elsewhere, but specifically around Pardot features and functions. So the primary use cases for the Pardot Developer Experience really center on these 3 items that you see before you. Again, this is just a primary use cases. It is not a complete set of what you can address by using the tools that are available to you. First, data augmentation. So when you're thinking about cleaning up data or enriching your data using third-party sources, that is one area that you would be using these tools for. Second, we've got advanced reporting. So when you're looking at maybe if you've got preferred BI tools within your organization that the enterprise is using the API in order to get some of this data into those tools. And then third, enhanced segmentation. So again, Pardot gives you very good segmentation tools to begin with, but there are maybe some third-party sources of data that you would like to maybe transform some of the data that you've got in Pardot and then pump it back in from a segmentation standpoint, or you want to update lists from other areas. So to further dive into a few of those, data augmentation, we've got a fun story later on about data augmentation that I particularly like. But thinking about just cleaning up data. So in your system, sometimes there is some manual entry of data, and it's not necessarily uniform. You can use the API to help clean that up, and Sercante will talk a little bit about some ways to do that and some examples going forward. And then also, if you're looking at enriching some of the data based off of either external sources of data, so some third-party places that you've got information, or just other systems in your organization that aren't necessarily talking to Pardot today. When you're looking at reporting and marketing attribution, again, there are tools available for you in Pardot that do a real good job of that. But again, there's also some places where the enterprise just has a preferred BI tool that they're looking for information across kind of all their systems. you can leverage the API in order to send this information to those systems in order to have a more holistic view of that data from an enterprise perspective. So that's one way of doing that. And then another way is there's also, if you've got maybe proprietary attribution models that you want to include, again, you can use the API to those ends as well. And then last, and certainly not least, enhanced segmentation. So segmentation, again, is the name of the game when it comes to marketing. If you're not segmenting properly or effectively, then you're not marketing properly or effectively at the end of the day. If you want to use data outside of Pardot to do an enhanced job from a segmentation perspective, or as we will hear later, if you want to transform this data based off of some maybe ideas and algorithms that you've got outside of the system, and then pump that back in for what your segmentation should be looking like, there's a way to accomplish that, again, with the API today, and new ways of doing that going forward as we look through the roadmap. So now that we've done like a quick introduction on why you would like to use the developer tools available to you today and the importance of the developer experience, I'm going to hand it over to Chris to talk about the how at this point.
All right, thank you, Dwayne. So yes, let's get into how you actually can extend your Pardot. So one of the key tools is obviously the application programming interface, and this is really the way to be able to help extend and create custom and unique solutions. So we have multiple types of endpoints available to you, really to be able to help provide and meet the use cases that you're looking for from a performance and volume perspective. So first we have our one-on-one API, which is really around just accessing and modifying single records. So this is going to be a really good use case when you need something that is time sensitive, such as you have an external system that has a UI, and you're updating information, say for a prospect, and you want that to be immediately reflected within Pardot. Then we also have our bulk API, which consists of query and batch endpoints as well. This is also a synchronous process, but is really good for larger volumes, so when you're dealing with handfuls of records and providing the ability for you to do that in a very time-sensitive manner. So this is good if you're trying to update or sync information, say on the minute to an hourly basis. And then lastly, this is our new endpoint types, which is Async API. And so this is really there for the large volume scenarios. So a good use case of this is if you're trying to export, say, your visitor activity from a zero-day perspective, this is going to help you be able to handle that large volume within your API limits. So now that we talked about the types, let's talk about the data coverage of the API. So we really have an extensive amount of information that you can access, from prospect information, which is very critical for marketing, to being able to get insights on your campaigns, as well as your assets. And so overall, we have really extensive coverage from kind of the bulk and one, but we're also starting to roll out our async endpoints. So the first two really are prospect and visitor activity. And so just to jump in, kind of tie this to some of the use cases Dwayne was talking about, some very important endpoints is prospect. So obviously that's the center of all your marketing. So of course that's a very valuable tool to be able to add and modify your prospects and also to retrieve them. So this is very helpful from a reporting standpoint when you want to get down to the prospect level. Also, if you're doing segmentation, to be able to add enrichment data characteristics, and also from just a basic cleansing perspective, because as you have that data more cleansed, you get more value. The other endpoint I want to reference is visitor activity, because this is obviously all your anonymous and prospect engagement. So this is really important from your attribution models if you want to create custom ones outside, and also to be able to get just that analytics insight in terms of what are the buying signals or behaviors before someone is a really good prospect or a really good lead. And so ultimately, we've chose both of these because your prospect database obviously can grow to the millions, and so you want to have a large volume way to be able to handle this data, and the visitor activity can grow to tens of millions and beyond. So now that we kind of talked about so I don't have enough time to go through all of the endpoints, but we will definitely reference our API guide later so that you can explore it deeper. And so to kind of just dig into this new Async API and just kind of show the value that's going to be provided from this, just going to compare it to our current bulk capabilities. So today we allow you to have, with the bulk, be able to process or import 50 records at a time. With the new Async, we're moving towards a data size. So you're going to be able to import 100 megabits of prospect data per import. And just to put this in context, that is, if you're just updating a single field, you'll be able to do 10 million records per import. From an export perspective, you are able to retrieve 200 records per request. And so this is going to eat up your activity if you're trying to export, say, 3 years worth of activity data from your system. So with the new Async API, we're going to allow you to at least be able to retrieve 6 months at a time per export. So what this is going to translate into is tens of millions of records that you're able to retrieve with just a handful of requests. And so how does it work? Well, the new Async API ultimately is an asynchronous process. So you're going to create your export request with the criteria. Then you're going to poll to wait until it's been finished, and then you're able to retrieve that within your convenience. So you can download the information, and you'll have 7 days until it expires. So what are some good use cases? Well, the bulk API is still valuable. As I mentioned, it's very helpful when you have to be able to sync information on a frequency, or you're just dealing with a handful of records, or you want to do search, right? But the new Async API is going to be very beneficial for that day zero, and also when you're trying to update, say, prospects on a daily basis. So now that we've kind of talked about where we are currently, let's talk about where we're going. So as I mentioned, we're focused on the Async API right now with prospect already delivered, visitor activity coming with our upcoming release. Then we're going to be moving into authentication. In order to be able to provide a more cohesive experience, we're going to enable all of the Salesforce OAuth flows for you to use from your authentication point. So it's not only is it going to provide that unified feel, but it's also going to better help protect your data. And then after that, next part of the journey is for us to start extending the API. So one of the things that many people may be familiar, if you have used our API, is we have what's called the AMP-SIA distinction, which is allowing multiple prospects same email address. So we're looking to remove that so you can just use one API endpoint and not have to worry about which one based on that configuration. And then lastly, we want to continue to extend our endpoints to provide more coverage for our assets, but also start getting into some of our metadata to where you're going to be able to retrieve, say, information about your automations or engagement studio programs, and potentially get to the point where you're able to configure them directly. So now that we talked about how you integrate, let's talk about where you develop. So currently we have the Pardot Developer Edition available for our partners and ISVs. And so this is ultimately a blank organization that gives you access to Pardot so that you can understand the feature functionality, but it also gives you access for API so they have a place to be able to develop and test these extensions. And then what we're moving into is our Pardot sandbox. So this is going to be a very critical and key component for our customers because it provides them a safe environment for them to leverage testing changes before they go into production. So the start of this journey is really just going to be a blank organization that is available to you to be able to try these configurations out and then implement them in production. But we do have a very great roadmap associated with this that is going to continue to evolve it. So as I mentioned, the first step is just to give you a blank sandbox, but then we're looking to allow you to be able to sync your configuration from production into that sandbox so you can have like-for-like settings. The next step is going to be allowing you to copy your assets over so that you have all the ingredients if you are, say, testing out an engagement studio program or testing out an automation. You can have the same components there that you have in your production environment. And then we really will reach nirvana when we hit the point where you're able to take that information and be able to deploy it from the sandbox back into production, really helping make it easy to be able to test and deploy. So now that we've kind of talked about the development tools, just wanted to see, since you guys use this extensively, like anything interesting that we talked about from a roadmap perspective?
Well, I don't believe in safe harbor, so I want it all tomorrow. But really, though, I'm pretty excited about the sandbox deployment. and having that sort of native, or that functionality that we've come to know and love inside of the platform, Salesforce platform now, having that in Pardot, so we're not, testing production is awesome. And then the extended API to deal with assets and metadata sort of gets my head like really going to do cool stuff. So.
Awesome. How about you, Mike?
I'm with Mike. I want it all tomorrow. I'm really excited about the Async API because I'm working with a couple big accounts who are trying to integrate into an enterprise data warehouse, and we're just overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data, and we're looking at weeks to get all the data to sync up for that initial sync, and the async will really help speed that process up.
Well, awesome. Well, we'll be providing that sooner than later. So, so since you guys really have been extensive users of the API and all our development tools, why don't you give us a couple of real-world examples?
So it seems like sometimes the hardest part of writing code isn't the code, it's getting budget to do it. So if we can use the API to start speeding up processes, and we can relieve some human time, some human capital, that's a great way to start this process. Let's pick a salesman. If he's a $1 million a year salesperson, that's $500 an hour, $8 a minute. And if we're spending time doing silly things like capitalizing names and correcting pick list values, is that a good use of that person's time doing data maintenance rather than taking time away from what they're really good at, which is being in front of the customer and selling. Conversely, with marketing, having them do things at the individual level that can be done by the API and other processes can cause this slowdowns with our API sync issues because there's data issues that takes us time to catch and to correct. So if we do some data augmentation, we can really speed up and relieve a lot of these issues with us. Silly things like capitalized name, right? That's an easy thing. We can format phone numbers in Pardot by API, so when it finally gets to Salesforce, our team can do one-touch dialing on their Salesforce One app, and we'd speed everything up. We could do some really painful things like normalizing our pick list values from Pardot to Salesforce, so that way our sync doesn't hit the sync error queue. We can clean that up in Pardot even before it becomes a problem. That's a huge win, and it saves so much time from our organization. We do things that work well with improving our segmentation and by cleaning up firmographic data, pending firmographic data onto our Pardot prospects, so we can make a better decision of, do we send these people into MQL as MQL leads, or do we hold on to them in Pardot a little bit longer? One of the best accidental use cases I found by augmenting data is something as silly as adding a random number. And I really wish I had a good story. My story is I added the random number, and like weeks later, I'm like, oh, I could do this with it. I could do that with it. Mike has a much better intentional story about adding a random number.
Thank you, Cruiser. Yeah, so we had a client come to us and say, we want to know ROI for our marketing, right? Immediate answer is, well, let's use campaign influence. Let's use BDBMA. Let's use all the tools available to us that we know and love, except they had a unique way of tracking or not tracking actual value of opportunities in their Salesforce and some other campaign issues along the way. So we just couldn't get there with the data in the way they normally would measure ROI. So their idea was, hey, let's do an empirical study of and take 10% of all the prospects that we have, put them in a bucket and don't touch them. The 90% we'll market to. At the end, every few months we'll check and see how the two buckets compare. Okay, initial thought in Pardot, I'll grab a list, I'll just split it 10%, 90% and be done. Well, we also want it for live form fills. We also want it for list imports. We want it for every person who comes in there needs to be split up. So as Cruiser says, Pardot doesn't math, so there's no idea of trying to create a random number in Pardot. The other limitation is we didn't have access to develop anything in Salesforce Sales Cloud because a big enterprise org going to take months to try and just get something simple in there. So our solution was turning to the API. So essentially what we did was on a Heroku server, every 10 minutes we're polling the org to say, show me newly created or newly modified records that do not have a random number. Gets the list, pulls it into Heroku, that does the math, gives them a random number, pushes the random number back to Pardot, which then inside of Engagement Studio programs, we just look and say, all right, 1 to 10, you're in the bucket. 11 to 100, you're getting marketing. And the cool thing was watching this live happen in the Engagement Studio program and watching about 10% of the people go into either bucket. The other way that we use this is actually in the same org, because now Cruiser had some time to get spinning on some other ideas, and this one came as an unexpected win that potentially saved sales a lot of headache. So in this org, they're very outreach heavy, and the sales team needs to follow up within a certain amount of time for every inbound activity that happens. Marketing came in and said, hey, we have this really awesome program. We're going to send some emails, do some activities. When people respond, we're going to create tasks, and we're going to alert the sales team to follow up. But this was a big list and a small sales team. So instead of overwhelming the sales team on day one, Cruiser's like, well, let's take 10% of the list and send them the email on day one. And then we'll take maybe 20% of the list on day two and 20% of the list on day three, and sort of slow the roll of what marketing was doing so sales could keep up. And so Cruiser has a couple more ideas on cool things with API.
Another one of my accidental discoveries is I built a traffic pulse capability within Pardot, which is basically just a window of recent activity. And I built it, and I showed it to my BDR team, and they're like, this is amazing. And they started building dynamic lists in Pardot so they can use these for their territories and start prospecting of people who are interested in us right now. And then when we clicked the sort by company, and all of a sudden we had this ABM clumping of, we got 3 different prospects from the same company interested in us. And it basically made a really, really fast, relevant prospecting list so the BDR team knows who they can focus on right now. It was a massive, massive win. It was amazing. What this looks like, again, Heroku, love Heroku. I built a weekly job that used the prospect endpoint, captured that score at the end of the week, wrote that to a custom field. And then I have a separate daily, or actually every 10 minutes, a separate process that runs every 10 minutes in Heroku, and that is grabbing all the prospects that have been activity or updated in the last 10 minutes, just trying to grab, narrowing down the list, grabbing just the people that are relevant. And I calculate the change between the score right now and the score from when I captured that freeze on the weekend, and I write that to a different custom field. And now I have that score change that's happened since the weekend, and that's my traffic pulse. I can now use that in Engagement Studio programs, dynamic lists, if I have a team that are empowered to kind of prospect out of Pardot, trying to find people that are relevant. And then, Mike?
Thank you. Yeah, so when Cruiser was telling me about this new idea of the traffic pulse and having the idea of not just what your score is, right? So the score is great, and it'll, keep going over time, and if someone goes away for a while, you can degrade their score. But there are those people who just sort of hang out and get a score and, open an email once a month or something, but they're not relevant to sales today, right? Maybe eventually sales will get to them. As a salesperson, I'm walking in the day, and I've got my list of tasks. I've got, engage alerts popping up and telling me, hey, someone's doing something right now. And that's all good things, but eventually that list is going to run out. So now I'm like, okay, who am I following up with? With the traffic pulse, it's very similar to what you may have seen in a couple of other platforms that use, flames or stars or whatever to show this kind of urgency. Like Cruiser alluded to, you can now have a lead list, contact list, whatever, that you're sorting by urgency. So I know these are the people I'm spending my time on today, because they've been doing a lot of stuff and they've been doing it recently. Taking that up to the ABM level, If you take that, do some roll-up fields or whatever you want in Salesforce to take all of the contacts, all the contact urgencies, roll it up to the account, well, now I can go and sort my accounts by that same urgency. So I've got account A, B, and C are the most urgent. I'm going to start pounding on the phones, and my co-sales, sales team will start pounding the phones on them too, because something is happening in those orgs. And then back to marketing. Marketing start using this urgency to essentially switch what we're doing for nurturing. So I might be on kind of a slow drip, kind of get things happening. Well, now my urgency is going up, so I'm going to switch them over to the fast. I'm hitting them with content every other day. I'm doing more personalized emails from sales, things like that. So there's just a couple of options or a couple of thoughts that we had, examples that we really liked from the API. Next, back over to Dwayne. Thanks for letting us present with you.
Thank you very much, Mike and Mike. So we just want to run through some developer resources that are available to you. And first I want to start off with, we're very interested in hearing feedback from you, not necessarily on this session itself, but on what you want to see from a development perspective. So this first link that we have up here, and then you can take pictures. Feel free to take pictures. We'll do a couple slides, and we'll throw it back up so you can take more pictures again. But the first link up here is for you to sign up and allow us to kind of contact you, get in touch with you, to hear some of your feedback on kind of what are you looking for from an API perspective. We'll be doing an open beta soon for sandboxes. What are you looking for from a sandbox perspective? So that's one place that you can help us help you going forward. For our partners in the room, this second link underneath this first column is a link for the Pardot Developer Edition. So this is effectively a blank org that's attached to a Salesforce developer account, and will allow you to play with Pardot, build what you want to build on top of it, and go forward with that. Second column, we've got a lot of documentation around the API, and there will be plenty more coming soon with the release of the Async API as well, so that's another place you can look. And the last column, you've also got your community, obviously. That's another place where you can see the link for signing up for the Partner Dev org. And then also, Sercante has a fantastic blog, the Spot for Pardot. It's one of my faves on my browser, so you should make it a fave on your browser as well. And as you've seen, they've got a lot of creative ideas on how to solve day-to-day problems that arise just from complications that come up with data at the end of the day. So also feel free to reach out to them to get some help from a hiring standpoint. So it's key takeaways, things that you should walk out of this room with. First, I will reiterate this again. There's the Pardot Developer Edition, so feel free as a partner to go up and sign up, play around with that, and then also give us feedback using that form that we had on the previous slide and on the slide after this one. From a customer standpoint, be aware that we've got an open beta coming up soon. One of the details around that is you'd have to have Pardot Advanced and a full sandbox in order to launch the sandbox to begin with. We'll be opening it up further as we go forward, but feel free to be involved in that. And then from a developer standpoint, you've seen the tools, but I like to say that it's a yo-go whippy kind of process. You're only going to get out what you get in, what you get in at the end of the day, or what you put in at the end of the day. So you need to be creative. You need to think about ways to bend Pardot to your will, as Mike likes to say. And that'll help out just the overall developer experience as we move forward. So with that, I want to thank everybody for coming. We will open it up for questions if you have them. And for that, thank you very much. And I'll put up the slide for those resources again.
This is tangentially related, I think. Okay. Is there any plans for the other direction, so outbound, any sort of like triggering or webhook real-time from Pardot to another system?
That's a great question.
Yes, so it is something that is not currently on our roadmap, but would love to talk to you more about it and get your use cases and start, maybe that will build the momentum for it.
I know how to make that work today, though. So we can send notification emails. So if we send notification emails to like a Zapier email parser,
Okay.
right? That's our outbound webhook trigger. And then we can do like a search within Zapier for that Pardot prospect, because don't trust the email parser, it's no good.
Yeah.
And then we can grab that data, and then we can send that where we really want it to
I
go.
suppose I could probably use like a Salesforce email, you know,
Something.
Apex
Yeah.
code, whatever, to parse it, do whatever I want to.
Yeah, and I mean, depending on what you're doing, you could also conceivably pull the API. 'Cause, you know, we have some processes that just go and look for data. It would only happen every so many
Yeah,
minutes,
that's
but
the problem. We can't wait for like the sync to the CRM. It's too long. So we need something that's like faster than it's like immediate, basically.
gotcha.
So completion action ultimately is kind of what I'm looking for. But, all right, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Does the blog give you information about setting up the Heroku instance, and can we get access to that as partners to Heroku? Do we have to pay for Heroku as developers? I mean, partners?
So is that related to y'all's blog? Or?
So, I mean, Heroku is a Salesforce product,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There is a free version of Heroku, so you can get started with that. It will run for 2 hours and it will shut itself off,
Okay.
which is enough for spinning something up and
learn,
learning
yeah.
how to do it. It's fairly inexpensive. It's like $25 a month for
Okay.
the smallest thing that will stay on and run all the time, and will run, you know, 500,000 record orgs out of that without any problems on a very small spend.
Okay.
There's I have a GitHub project
Yeah.
available that has a country state fixer that does that alignment between the mismatch between the GUIP and Pardot, and getting that fixed so it goes into Salesforce without creating a sync error. And within that, there's actually instructions on how to set up Heroku.
Oh,
and
awesome.
It kind of walks you through that process, get that set up and installed. So there's some Heroku setup, some PHP setup, and that, and then getting that set up to run. And that's on GitHub under, if you look up Sercante.
Sercante, okay.
Or you can
Fixer.
grab, ping him on Twitter if you need more info.
Yeah.
I will be. I mean, that's a given. So then for the last question is, can we connect Heroku to a developer sandbox? That's a Salesforce question, I think. To a Pardot sandbox.
Heroku will connect to whatever you want it to
Okay.
connect to. It's an independent like app processing
Okay.
spot. It's like it's easy hosting is why I picked it, and it's also under Salesforce contract, so it's really easy to convince clients to buy it.
It's just hitting the right API endpoints, right?
Right.
When you code it.
Yeah, when you configure it, you can configure it to Salesforce. You
sandbox.
can configure it to Sandbox.
Cool.
It's just how you log in.
Awesome. Thanks.
Great blog idea, also.
We have a requirement to share marketing assets between our 5 Pardot orgs, and I was wondering if we could leverage the API to, well, at least build up a metadata repository where people then could pick things from. But this is an idea you could follow. And secondly, the current API doesn't support it, right? Because you talk this being a roadmap topic. So my first initial glance at the API list then probably was wrong when I saw something like email. I said, oh yeah, it's great. We can start building something when we're back from Dreamforce.
So our API does cover some of our assets, so you would be able to get some of that information. But there also, we do know there's a few gaps as well, but we do plan to, over time plug those. But there's also some other activities that our product managers are exploring as well in terms of helping sync assets into other locations within Salesforce, which is potentially another way to get to that point down the road. Yes, I do believe that is on the roadmap for down the road. Safe harbor, y'all. All right. Any other questions?
But that would be really cool. Have like an asset library that you just grab the metadata and drop it into a new org.
Yep.
We're doing that when it's possible. That's happening.
Any other questions? Going once? Going twice? All right. Thank you again.
All right. Thanks, everyone.